Be careful, because he can't see us.
My husband, the Mafia boss, said, "I never loved you." He thought I'd accept that sentence the way an obedient wife accepts an order. In silence, wounded, too small to react. What a beautiful mistake. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't ask if it was a lie. It was Massimo Belandi who offered me a handkerchief. The man Dante hated. The man all of Palermo feared. My husband said he never loved me. So I let his enemy offer me shelter. And for the first time, I saw the man who swore he didn't want me lose control. Hi, I'm Lena. A special shout out to those of you watching Book 1 for free here on the My Stories platform, completely ad-free and uninterrupted. Chapter 1. The Yellowed Contract. The June morning poured into the attic as if it wanted to steal the paint from my hands. I was kneeling over an 18th century canvas, the hem of my dress stained with linseed oil, when I heard the bells of Palermo's cathedral toll 9 times far away. I counted. I always counted. I told myself that, if one day I ran away to Florence before the wedding my father had arranged, I'd recognize the right hour by the sound of the wrong bells. The canvas was by a minor painter, anonymous in the catalogs, but it had a crooked-mouthed angel I'd been fixing for 3 weeks. Restoring a mouth requires the patience of a jeweler. I didn't have the patience of a jeweler. I had stubbornness, and that, in my family, always served the same end. Signorina Serafina. The old nanny's voice climbed the stairs before she did. The Don asked you to come down to the study. I lifted my head. The old nanny stood at the threshold, her apron rumpled, her eyes displeased as always. Did he say what time? He said now. She rolled her eyes. And he said to wipe the paint off your cheek first. I touched my cheek with the back of my hand. Paint, of course. Always paint. I went down the attic stairs slowly, counting the steps so I wouldn't think. My father's house was too big for the number of people who slept inside it. It smelled of old firewood and furniture wax, and in every hallway there was a portrait of some dead Kalana I had never met. I grew up believing those painted eyes watched me more than my father did. The study was on the lower floor, with a heavy oak door that creaked in every season. I knocked twice. I went in without waiting for an answer, the privilege of a legitimate daughter. The old Don Colonna was sitting behind the desk, and he looked older than the week before. Heartsick for years, he had learned to hide his fatigue beneath well-cut vests. That morning, he didn't hide it. His hands trembled slightly over a yellowed sheet of paper. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." "Sit down, Serafina." I sat. I crossed my hands in my lap to hide the paint. He noticed. He always noticed. He pushed the paper across the desk until it stopped in the middle. The sheet was thick, the color of cold tea, and the handwriting had faded along the folds. At the top, in firm letters, I read my name. Below, another, Dante Ferraro, and further down, the date. A date 16 years ago, when I was 7 and still messed around with watercolor palettes in the kitchen. I didn't cry. My breathing didn't even change. I learned very early, in this house, that crying in front of men who decide things is the same as signing underneath. When did you intend to tell me? Today. Today because the war is bad? Or today because I turned 23 last week? Today because I'm tired, Serafina. I looked at his trembling hand. I looked at the Kalana crest on the wall, an olive tree over a key I'd always thought was ugly. I looked at the paper. "Why me?" I asked. "My half-sister also has your blood, sir. She doesn't have the surname. She has the blood. Cosa Nostra doesn't seal peace with illegitimate blood, my daughter. It doesn't work. And what does it work with? With a dress and a chapel?" He didn't answer. He closed his eyes for a second, as if counting to 10 inside, and when he opened them they were the eyes of a man who had decided this long ago. I recognized the look. It was the same one he used when sending capos to the ports. "The Ferraros lost 3 men last year," he said low. "We lost 2. If this goes on one more winter, all of Palermo burns. You're the only thing 2 tired men will agree to share. I'm not a thing. I know. Then why? Because you're the best thing I have." He smiled without joy. "And that's what you offer when what's at stake is everything else." I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab the paint from upstairs and mark the wall with the name of Florence, with the name of the studio I dreamed of, with the name of every city in my old notebook where I had promised myself I'd grow old among canvases. Instead, I took a deep breath. "I accept," I said, and my voice came out too firm even for me. "On one condition." He raised his head. "I keep restoring. Married, widowed, alive, dead, I keep restoring. Don't ask me to stop, and don't ask him to ask me to." My father was silent for a long time. Then he did something I didn't expect. He folded the yellowed paper in three and put it back inside a drawer, slowly, like someone tucking away a sentence. "Granted," he said. "Now go change your dress. The meeting is this afternoon." This afternoon? At a neutral villa, on the outskirts. He's already left Palermo. I stood up. I walked to the door. Before leaving, I looked back and asked the only thing that still mattered to me to know. "Does he know my name?" My father took a moment to answer. "He knows everything, Serafina, including that you restore." He was the one who accepted the condition before I had the courage to ask. I closed the door without making a sound. I rested my forehead against the wood for half a second. Then I ran up the attic stairs, grabbed the small paint-scraping knife, and in a gesture no one saw, I drew a short line on my palm, thin, the size of a paper cut, just to feel that I still ruled over something that day. The neutral villa was half an hour by car, on a stone road between lemon trees. I wore dark blue, pulled my hair into a plain bun, and didn't put on lipstick. My petty revenge. If he wanted to buy a bride without consulting me, he'd have to look at the bride hole, with no display window. The villa had high ceilings, whitewashed walls, and a long table with white flowers in the middle, the kind no one chooses. They arrive by order. My father didn't go. He sent his foreman, 2 distant capos, and nothing else. I understood. It was a meeting between her and him, with mute witnesses so no one could later say it had happened in a closed room. Dante Ferraro arrived at 4 sharp. I heard the cars stop before I saw him. 3 engines. When the salon door opened, in came first a man of about 60, bald with the eyes of a tired priest. This one I already knew the name. Ettore, the consigliere, the only person in all of Sicily to whom Don Ferraro listened without arguing. Ettore greeted me with a brief nod, like someone greeting a church door, and moved to the window. Behind him, Dante. Dark suit, white shirt, no tie. Hair combed back, a jaw that looked like it had been cut with a ruler, and the eyes were the thing nobody prepared me for. They weren't beautiful eyes. They were eyes that measured. He walked into the salon like a man walking into territory he had already decided not to invade, and on the way to the table he didn't look at any capo, only at me. Once. A long look. And then he looked away. I stood up. I held out my hand. He took my hand and didn't kiss it, pressed it lightly, with the firmness of someone closing a deal. "Signorina Colonna." Don Ferraro. His voice was deep and strangely low for a salon that size. We sat. They brought wine. He didn't drink. I took a sip to irritate him, and if he was irritated, I didn't see it. We talked about lemon trees. We talked about the weather. We talked about the bad road between Palermo and the villa. I counted his sentences, because it was more interesting than listening to them. In 3 hours, he spoke 8 sentences. 8. On the 7th, he said something about the port, and on the 8th, he asked if I had any demand my father might have forgotten. I rested my chin on my hand, and looked at him with the calm I only managed to gather because I had already cut my palm that morning. "Don Ferraro," I said, with the formal Italian my aunt taught me to humiliate cousins. "A question out of curiosity, not demand. Do you usually buy women wholesale, or was it an isolated case?" Ettore choked near the window. He laughed once, low, and pretended it was a cough. The capos didn't move. Dante didn't laugh, but something at the corner of his mouth, something that wasn't a smile, was the shadow of one, undid itself before it formed. His eyes dropped to my mouth. Once. Twice. I saw them both. "Isolated case," he answered slowly. "And I didn't buy. You are what's being traded. I am the other half of the trade. How chivalrous of you to remember. I always remember." I held his gaze longer than I should have. He didn't look away first. I did, and I hated myself for it the rest of the afternoon. The meeting ended with the foreman reading clauses in a low voice, and neither of the two interrupted. At the end, Dante stood. He held out his hand again. This time, before letting go, he tilted his head half a centimeter and said, "Signorina, on Saturday it's at the chapel in the woods. I hope you don't arrive late." "I never arrive late, Don Ferraro. I arrive at the exact hour I decide to arrive." He let go of my hand, and he left. It was at that moment, when he was already with his back turned, that another man approached from the side hallway, younger than Ettore, dark hair, a family smile. He came up to me with the naturalness of someone who had already been introduced to me in another life. "Cousin," he said, and made a quick bow that I recognized as a childhood joke. "Tiziano Colonna, 2nd degree, on your mother's side. I was assigned to serve the couple. Cars, roads, anything." He took my hand and lightly kissed the tips of my fingers. "You don't recognize me, but we played in the same vineyard when I was 11. I smiled. It had been so long since I'd smiled without calculation that the smile came out whole. Tiziano, I remember the boy who fell from the olive tree trying to impress me. That's me. Still falling? Only for beautiful women, cousin. I laughed. For real. Ettore from the window took a step to the side to see me better. On the other side of the room, near the door, Dante stopped. He didn't turn fully, just turned his head, slowly, like someone hearing a door unlock behind him. He looked at Tiziano. He looked at my hand in Tiziano's hand. He looked at me. He didn't say anything. He left. I didn't make much of it. I thought it was just his way. Tiziano squeezed my hand again, with cousin's affection, and lowered his voice like someone offering a silly secret. Cousin, anything, count on me. Road, message, escape. Escape? I raised an eyebrow. If one day you need to escape from your own husband, cousin, this driver here is the one to count on. I laughed again. I found it funny. I found it the most Colonna thing in the world. Outside, beyond the tall window, I saw Dante Ferraro get into a black car without looking back. I felt a brief shiver at the back of my neck I couldn't name, and I looked away from the window. Chapter 2. Distress Signal by the Pool. The chapel in the woods was small, white, with narrow windows that let in little light, and on Saturday morning the capos of the Ferraro family were lined up on both sides of the nave like tin soldiers. I counted, 12 on each side, 24 armed men for a ceremony that was supposed to be sacred. My dress was heavy. It was white lace, an heirloom from a great-aunt who died at 20, and the seams in the back bit when I took a deep breath. I took deep breaths on purpose. It was a way of remembering I still had lungs. My father took me by the arm. His hand trembled more than on the day of the contract, and halfway to the altar I placed my hand over his to steady him, because in that second, I no longer knew which of us two was more afraid. He squeezed my arm. He let go. He took 3 steps back. Dante waited at the altar, in a black suit. No ring yet. No smile. He looked at me the way someone looks who has already decided to look, and when the priest started speaking in Latin, he didn't take his eyes off any word coming from mine. I said yes. He said yes. We exchanged plain bands of old gold. When his went onto my finger, I felt that the ring weighed more than the dress. When mine went onto his, he closed his hand into a discreet fist for half a second, a gesture no one saw, and that I saw whole. The priest joined us in archaic Italian. The capos struck their heels against the stone twice, as if sealing the troops, and it was the coldest sound I'd ever heard in my life. It was outside, on the chapel steps, that Tiziano appeared again. He was wearing a gray jacket, more put together than at the meeting, and came up to me with a smile so familial it made me want to cry for the first time that morning. Signora Ferraro, he said, and the first time I heard the new surname on his lips, struck me strangely in the chest. Tiziano leaned over my hand and kissed it with more formality than he had at the neutral villa. Loyalty is an old word, cousin. I swear it to you. Cars, roads, everything. I laughed quietly. My nerves were on edge, and the laugh came out a bit crooked. Tiziano, I told you once, if one day I need to escape my husband, you're the one I count on. It's me, cousin. Then stay close. He laughed too. He kissed my hand again and stepped back, with the grace of a courtier. I felt, before turning, Dante's gaze on the back of my neck. When I turned, I found my husband at the other end of the steps, beside the consigliere, standing between 2 capos, his eyes locked on the 2 of us. He didn't look angry. He looked as if doing math. I held his gaze. I smiled the most innocent smile in the world. He stepped down without hurry. He came up to me. He placed his hand on my back, at the exact point between the shoulder blades, and said, so only I could hear, "You laugh too loud with the driver." I laugh at the volume I have, Don Ferraro. Lungs rule the laugh, not the husband. He looked at me, twice, again, at the mouth, and moved his hand from my back to the elbow, and led me to the car without answering. In the car, he stayed silent for the entire trip until the cortege turned onto the road to Cefalù. The road from Palermo to Cefalù takes nearly 2 hours, and most of it is along the sea. I pressed my temple against the glass. The sea hit the rocks on the right side. Dante looked to the left side. We didn't talk. At some point in the journey, Ettore, from the front seat, gave a slight cough and said without turning, "Beautiful ceremony, signora." It was a very well-organized funeral, Ettore. Ettore gave a short laugh, the second in 2 days, and Dante took a deep breath beside me. I don't know if it was impatience or something else. The villa in Cefalù was white and blue, with a terrace over the sea, a stone pool by the lemon trees, and rooms enough to house 3 families. Dante had my luggage taken to one room. He had his taken to another, at the end of the hall. I laughed alone when the servant closed the door. Honeymoon, my father had said. Honeymoon. That first week, we always dined at the same long table. He talked about ports. He talked about judges. He talked about a new route from Catania. On the second dinner, I appeared in the wrong dress on purpose. A red dress, low cut, nothing appropriate for a formal table between husband and 3 capos. Dante lifted his eyes from his plate. He lingered half a second on my mouth. He lingered a second on my neckline. He went back to his plate. He didn't say anything. At dessert, the youngest capo at the table, young, with short cropped hair, big eyes, looked at my neckline 3 times in a row. I pretended not to see. Dante saw. Dante didn't raise his voice. Dante simply finished his wine, set the glass on the saucer with a dry click, and said, in the tone of someone commenting on the weather, "Tomorrow you're in Catania." "Yes, Don. For 6 months." The young man went pale. He swallowed dry. He didn't answer. He stood up from the table when Dante made a small nod, and left without looking back. I kept staring at my husband's glass. I took a slow sip of mine. "Jealousy, Don Ferraro?" I asked softly, because the other 2 capos were still nearby. "Discipline, signora. Discipline looks like jealousy these days." He didn't answer. He stood, said goodnight with a curt nod, and went to his room at the end of the hall. I stayed on the veranda watching the sea until the moon rose. I thought, jealousy of property then. He's jealous of my married name, not of me. I was wrong, but that night it was the only explanation that fit in my head. On the 3rd day, during breakfast, I took Dante Alighieri's book from the salon's bookshelf and brought it with me to the veranda just to have an excuse to quote him at dinner. At night, with the wine half finished, I looked at Dante over my glass and recited, from memory, a passage from the Inferno in archaic Italian, 3 lines, slow, about those who err for love. Ettore choked for the 3rd time in a week. He laughed at his own cough. Dante looked at me like someone who had understood the game and decided not to play. "Signora," he said, "if you intend to quote me with my own name to irritate me, you'll need more than 3 verses. How much do I need?" "A whole lifetime." I blinked. I swallowed the wine too fast. Ettore disguised a second laugh behind his napkin. Dante stood up from the table before dessert and went out to the terrace to smoke. I didn't even know he smoked. Through the glass door, from where I was, I saw the cigarette ember tremble a single time. A single one. On the 4th day, by the pool, he came down shirtless for the first time. I swear I didn't look. I looked. He had an old scar marking his right shoulder and 2 marks on his back. I looked away to the nearest lemon tree and couldn't go back to looking at him for the next 10 minutes. He sat on the lounge chair beside me. He didn't speak. He brought a thin book, opened it in the middle, and read, without moving a muscle. It was the closest he had been to me since the chapel. I looked at the pool. I looked at the sun. I looked at his hand, motionless on the spine of the book, with the new ring tapping lightly on the paper when he turned the page. "Don Ferraro," I said, "can I make an absurd proposal? You've made few besides that since Saturday. Then one more won't hurt." He turned his head. He didn't close the book. He waited. "Distress signal," I said, "between husband and wife. In case, hypothetically, at some point in my life I'm kidnapped by one of your annoying enemies. I need a way to warn you without opening my mouth." He looked at me for about 3 seconds. I saw the corner of his mouth move half a millimeter. "Signora, Don, you're asking me for a distress signal by the pool. I'm asking you for a distress signal by the pool. Do you have any suggestion?" I raised my hand. I crossed my index finger over my middle finger. I pressed both onto my left wrist on the inside, over the vein. "This," I said. "Discreet. It fits in a greeting, in a wave, in a smile. It fits under a sleeve. No one sees. Only those waiting to see." He looked at my crossed fingers on my wrist, for a long time. Then he raised his hand, large, marked, with the heavy ring, and repeated the gesture. Slowly, 2 fingers crossed, pressed to his wrist. Once. So I would see. "Sworn," he said. "And do you swear never to use it?" "I swear I'll laugh at you if you use it." "Deal," he laughed. For the first time in 7 days, Dante Ferraro laughed. A low, short laugh that lasted half a second, and disappeared as if he himself had been startled at having laughed. I tucked that whole laugh into some inner pocket of my chest, and didn't give it back to him. That night, walking back from the terrace to my room, I crossed paths with him in the hallway. It wasn't planned. He was leaving the small library with a glass of water in his hand. I was in a robe, barefoot, with my hair loose. The hallway was narrow. When I passed by him, the sleeve of my robe brushed against his arm. He stopped. I stopped. He didn't look at me first in the eyes. He looked at my mouth. His free hand rose halfway toward my face and froze in the air 3 fingers from my cheek. I felt the heat of his palm before I felt the palm. I didn't breathe. He didn't either. "Señora," he said, with a voice lower than he'd used the entire week. "Dawn, go back to your room. I'm going. Now." He didn't lower his hand. I didn't move from the spot. For an entire second, it was as if the hallway had shrunk around us. I smelled his soap, woodsy, and the smell of the wine he'd had at dinner, and anything beneath those 2 scents I couldn't name. He was the one who pulled back. He lowered his hand before touching. He took a step back. He pressed his back against the library door like someone who needs a support he can't ask for. His eyes didn't leave my mouth. "Good night, Signora Ferraro." "Good night, Don Ferraro." I walked to my room without hurrying, because hurrying would have been defeat. But when I closed the door behind me, I pressed my forehead to the wood and stayed there too long. The skin on the arm where the sleeve of the robe had touched his arm was burning as if I had passed too close to a candle. I thought, he pulled back. I thought, why? I thought, there's something cracked inside this man that I haven't seen yet. I fell asleep with my hand clenched into a fist over my belly, and at some point in the early morning, I can't say if it was a dream or a memory, I dreamed of his hand 3 fingers from my cheek, motionless, undecided, and of my own fingers crossed at my wrist asking for help from something I didn't yet have a name to call. Chapter 3. This doesn't change anything. The Ferraro villa woke up with me before 7. I still hadn't learned to call that house mine. The hallways were too wide, the ceilings too high, and every employee paused at the threshold to ask if the signora desired coffee on the terrace or in the small parlor, as if I were a luxury guest who could leave at any moment. In a way, I was. I had mentally packed my bags 3 times since we'd returned from Cefalù, and 3 times I had unpacked, because I still hadn't decided if I hated my husband's silence more, or the curiosity he provoked in me. Ettore was waiting for me in the dining room with an open ledger and a steaming cup. 60 years old, a priest's voice, an immaculate gray suit even at 7 in the morning. He was the consigliere, the oldest counselor in the house, the only person Dante listened to without interrupting, and had decided, for reasons I didn't yet understand, that it fell to him to introduce me to the daily life of a Ferraro wife. "Buongiorno, signora," he said, rising with the courtesy of another century. "Today the house receives deliveries until noon. The signor will dine out. Again. Ettore added no justification, and I didn't ask. There are questions one asks a husband. There are questions one asks a priest. And there are questions one doesn't ask a consigliere, unless one wants to hear an answer careful enough to answer nothing. I sat down, thanked him for the coffee, and tried not to think about the fact that Dante had left the villa before dawn for the 4th time that week, without leaving a note on my nightstand. It was at that moment that Bambina ran in her pajamas, with a rag doll under her arm and her hair tangled from sleep. "Aunt Sarah," she said, climbing into the chair beside me with the dexterity of someone who did that every day. "Why do you sleep in one room and Uncle Dante sleep in another if we're married?" Ettore choked on his coffee. Bambina was 6 years old, was Dante's niece on the side of a brother who'd died 5 years before, and lived in the east wing of the villa with a nanny who loved to lose sight of her in the morning. She was also the only family member who looked at me without weighing anything. "Sweetie," I answered, smoothing her hair with both hands. "It's because Uncle Dante snores. He snores like an old engine." Ettore coughed again, this time audibly, and I pretended not to hear. Bambina furrowed her brow, thoughtful, and then gave a child's victorious smile of having understood something adult. "Then we buy a new engine." "Excellent solution," I agreed. "I'll present the proposal." Ettore closed the ledger with exaggerated calm, stood, and said, without looking at me, "Signora, if you intend to run this house with humor, you'll need more coffee." It was the closest thing to approval I had received in 2 weeks. The afternoon would be different. I didn't know it yet, and maybe that's why the day started so light. Dante had promised me at breakfast the day before, with 6 dry words, that we'd go to Catania to see a Caravaggio exhibition opening for only 3 days. I had laid out the dress, laid out the shoes, laid out the small bag where the notebook fit in which I jotted down art cities in the handwriting of someone who still believed in Florence. I was in the middle of tying the sandal strap when Ettore came up the stairs and stopped at the threshold of my room. "Signora, the signor asked me to inform you that the trip to Catania has been cancelled." I lifted my head slowly. Cancelled why? It wasn't my place to ask. And whose was it? Ettore made that diplomatic pause I was already learning to decipher. It meant that it was Dante's, and that Dante hadn't explained, and that no one in that house explained anything Dante hadn't authorized. I thanked him with a nod. I waited for the door to close. I took off the sandal. I took off the other. I stood up. The painting was hanging on the wall of my improvised studio, a deactivated sewing room I had transformed into a studio in the first week, with an easel, linseed oil, small pins, and the only canvas from my trousseau I had brought from my father's house. It was small, from the early 19th century, a garden scene with two women reading, without great historical value, but with a craquelure detail along the bottom that I intended to restore with Sicilian patience. I tore it from the wall with both hands and threw it against the bookshelf. The canvas tore at the bottom corner. The frame broke into 3 pieces, and the sound was louder than I expected. I sat on the floor. I rested my forehead on my knees. I didn't cry. I had decided, on the day I saw the yellowed contract, that I wouldn't cry because of Dante Ferraro, but I trembled for about 3 minutes. When I got up, I gathered the shards carefully, wrapped the torn canvas in a cotton cloth, took it to the corner of the closet, and shut the door. No one would come asking. The whole house had been trained not to see what I didn't want to show. 3 days later, a late morning Tuesday with the sun already high over the villa, Ettore called me to the studio with that usual neutral voice. The canvas was on the table, not the torn canvas, the whole canvas. Restored with the precision of a professional restorer, the bottom corner reattached with fine glue, the craquelure preserved, the frame new, carved from the same wood, no note, no warning, no witness. I touched the bottom edge with the tip of my finger. The glue still gave off the sweet smell of linseed oil and fresh varnish. Someone had worked on it for 2 nights at least. "Signora," said Ettore from the door, "the signor asked that you not move it until tomorrow, because of the varnish." I didn't answer. I couldn't, actually. I stood there looking at the canvas with the ridiculous feeling of someone who has just received a love letter written in code that she herself invented. Dante had restored the canvas himself. Dante, who barely knew the difference between tempera and oil, who had never set foot in a museum in my presence, who had hands made for pulling triggers and sealing deals. I kept that silence like gold. I said nothing to him at dinner. Nothing. And I went to sleep that night with a heart more dangerous than it had been in 3 weeks, because I had understood, lying in the dark, that men who lie don't restore paintings at 4 in the morning. The Riva family wedding was set for the following Saturday. The Rivas were fragile allies, recently pacified after a 2-decade quarrel with the Ferraros over a strip of sea near Mondello. The young Don getting married was a certain Lucino, just over 30, a recent heir, still with that eagerness to prove masculinity that only very insecure and very armed men managed to condense into a single smile. I arrived at the salon arm in arm with Dante, wearing a moss-green dress I had chosen specifically because it was the opposite of any color that would say, "Mafioso's wife." Dante was in a black tuxedo, bow tie crooked on purpose, and 3 centimeters of protocol distance between his elbow and my waist. He looked at me once on the stairs and said, in the lowest possible tone, "Don't dance with anyone." Why? Because I said so. Solid argument, husband. He looked ahead. Lucino took me out to dance on the 3rd song. He didn't ask permission. Men of that circle didn't ask. Not for wives. Not for women in general. Just held out his hand. And I, out of pure spirit of contradiction, accepted. He danced well, I must say, but the hand on my waist slipped 2 fingers below the decent position on the first turn, and 3 fingers below on the second. I was already preparing the most venomous formal Italian sentence in my repertoire, when I felt, without seeing, the entire salon change temperature. Dante was crossing the dance floor, not in a hurry, not with a scandal, with the slowness of a man who knew the entire salon would stop for him, and therefore didn't need to speed up. He pressed his broad hand on my lower back, faced Lucino without saying a word, and simply took his place in the middle of the song. Lucino opened his mouth to protest, then closed it, took 2 steps back, and disappeared in the direction of the bar. Dante's hand on my waist was firm, high, in the correct position of a man dancing with his wife in public. The other took mine. His eyes weren't on Lucino's face. They were on mine. "Jealousy, husband?" I whispered. "Inventory. Lie. Inventory, Serafina. He danced with me until the end of the song, then to the end of the next. Then to the end of a third I'd have sworn I hadn't heard begin. His hand on my waist trembled once, very slightly, in the beat between one turn and another. I felt the tremor pass through the fabric of my dress, and I said nothing. He didn't either. We returned to the Ferraro villa just before midnight, and the sky was already closing over Palermo. The storm arrived at 2 a.m. I was reading in bed, or pretending to read because the book had been open on the same page for 40 minutes, when the lights flickered again, and went out altogether. The villa fell into absolute silence, that ancient silence of a stone house without electricity, in which you hear the rain hitting the windows as if the house were under attack. I got up. I put on my robe. I went barefoot down to the library after a candle and the volume of poetry I had left there the previous afternoon. I found Dante. He was with his back turned, by the drinks table, his white shirt unbuttoned at the first 3 buttons, a bottle of cognac in his hand. The single lit candle on the table cast half of his face in shadow. He didn't turn when he heard my bare feet enter the library. He just poured a second dose into a second glass, without asking if I wanted any. "Aren't you going to sleep?" I asked. "No. Because of the storm? Or because of me?" "Because of me." That made me stop. I accepted the glass. The cognac went down warm in my throat, with that old taste of oak and of expensive things saved for the wrong occasions. Dante looked at me over the rim of his glass, and I saw for the first time, in that dim light, what he'd been trying to hide in the Riva salon. "You restored the painting," I said low. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. Signora," he began, and stopped, because the word came out strange in his mouth. I took a step. He didn't pull back. I took another. That was when he set the glass on the table with more force than he needed to, crossed the distance between us in 2 strides, and pinned me against the bookshelf, back against the wood, his hands on my face, his mouth on mine without warning, without excuse, without question. He kissed like someone drowning. I grabbed the front of his shirt with both hands because I needed to hold on to something, and the book of poetry fell on the rug, and the candle flickered on the sill, and somewhere in the house, thunder cracked so close that the windows vibrated. Dante held my face with the wrong delicacy of someone accustomed to not being delicate, and his other hand found my wrist and pinned it against the bookshelf as if afraid I would flee. I didn't flee. I kissed back with the same disorderly hunger, the same accumulated rage of 3 weeks of silences, the same desire to force him to admit that his hand had trembled in the Riva salon because of me and no one else. When he finally pulled his mouth from mine, he still kept his forehead pressed to mine. His breathing was wrong. Mine was too. "This doesn't change anything," he said, low. "Lie. This doesn't change anything." He stepped back. He let go of my wrist. He grabbed his coat from the chair without looking at me, crossed the library, and walked out into the dark hallway, as if the storm were following him from the inside out. I stayed pressed against the bookshelf for 15 minutes. My mouth burned. My wrist burned. The cognac on my tongue tasted of broken promise. I slowly touched my lower lip with my thumb, and there, alone, in the dark of that library too big for me, I understood 2 things at the same time. Dante had lied 3 times that night, in the salon, in the library, and in the final sentence. And I no longer had anywhere to take that information inside me, except to an old cafe on Via Maqueda that Tiziano had shown me a week before, saying, with that easy smile of a kind cousin, that there nobody looked at anybody twice. I decided that, the next time I cried, I would cry there. Chapter 4. Say It. The weeks that followed had the taste of brown sugar burning in the pan. A kiss in the kitchen, on an afternoon when I was slicing lemon for the cook, and Dante walked through the door as if he had lost the way to his own study. He pinned me against the counter, slowly took the knife from my hand, kissed me without saying a word, and left. A kiss in the car on the way to Catania, with the driver deliberately looking out the right window while the left was given over to the silence of the 2 of us in the back. A kiss in his study with the door ajar, one morning when I went to deliver a letter from my father and stayed 5 minutes longer because he rested his hand on the back of my neck and said "stay," softly, before pulling back as he always did, before saying some technical sentence about ports and judges. He never slept with me. He never said anything affectionate. I had understood 3 weeks after the storm that Dante Ferraro was a man capable of kissing me as if I were the last good thing in the world, and 3 minutes later, treating me the way he treated the consigliere, with technical courtesy, and eyes on another horizon. I still didn't know if that was cowardice, strategy, or trauma, and had decided, deep down, that it wasn't up to me to find out. It was up to him to say, but he didn't say. And that's why I started crying in places where he couldn't see me. The old cafe on Via Maqueda was 10 blocks from the villa, hidden between a fabric store and a pharmacy that smelled of anise. It was frequented by old card players, by widows who read the newspaper alone for hours, and by a gray cat who slept in the window display on a wool cloth. The coffee was bad, too strong, almost bitter, and maybe that's why nobody recognized me there. People who went to a cafe like that went to forget, not to look. Tiziano started taking me. All I had to do was call from my room saying I need to go out, and he'd come down the lane in 15 minutes, open the back door, ask in family Italian, "Sera cugina?" and drop me at the corner without further questions. He'd wait across the street inside the car, with the newspaper open, pretending to read it. When I'd come out with red eyes, he'd start the engine without commenting on anything, drive me back to the villa via a longer route than necessary, and get out to open the door with that smile that seemed to me, in those days, the only thing that didn't ask anything of me. I thought it was familial discretion, and I clung to that explanation like someone clinging to the only certainty available on a rainy night. The night of the attack was too hot for July. We were leaving the port of Palermo in a convoy of 3 cars, Dante's in front, mine in the middle, the capo's behind. After a brief meeting I hadn't been invited to understand. I was in the back seat with my head resting against the window, thinking about nothing important, when the explosion came. It was the front car. I saw the flash before I heard the blast. I saw the car jump nearly a meter off the ground. I saw the passenger door fly to the right side of the street. I saw glass spray like hail. I saw fire rise from the engine in an orange wave that looked indecent there, under such a clear summer sky. My driver, a man from the Ferraro family named Salvo, older, kind, shouted for me to stay down, and the car braked sharply, throwing me against the front seat. I heard the crying before I heard any order. It was a child. High-pitched, broken, the kind of cry no adult woman forgets after hearing it just once. It was coming from somewhere among the wreckage of the first car, and I understood in 3 seconds, without needing to think, that it was the son of the capo who had been traveling up front, a boy of about 4 whom I had seen from afar playing in the gardens of the villa 2 weeks earlier. I opened the door against Salvo's order. "Signora, no." I didn't listen. I got out. I ran. The street was full of smoke and glass and people screaming in 3 different languages. I ran barefoot over the shards. I had lost a shoe getting out of the car and hadn't gone back to grab it. And when I got near the first car, the heat of the still-burning engine pushed me back like a physical wall. I saw the boy huddled against the front tire, his little arms over his head, no visible scratch on him, but paralyzed by the noise. I picked him up. I yanked him out of there with more strength than I had. I felt a thin, deep cut open on my forearm as I passed by one of the twisted doors, a high splinter that went into the skin like a knitting needle and came out leaving a red line slowly filling. I didn't stop. I carried the boy to the second car, handed him to Salvo, went back outside just to confirm that no one else was breathing there. No one else was breathing there. I returned to the car. I sat down. Only then did I look at my arm. The blood had already run down to my wrist and formed a small pool in my palm. I didn't cry. I was calm in a way that scared me the next day when I remembered. It was Dante who cleaned the wound that night at the villa. Ettore had brought the doctor, and the doctor had already left an hour earlier. The cut had been cleaned, sutured with 6 fine stitches, bandaged. I was sitting in the bedroom armchair, still wearing the robe Dante had given me when I arrived, when he came in without knocking. He'd come from the bath, dark hair dripping drop by drop onto the collar of his white shirt, and was carrying a small basin with cotton, a little bottle of antiseptic, a new bandage. "The doctor already did it," I said. The doctor did his job. He sat on the stool in front of the armchair. He took my arm with a delicacy I had never felt from him before, not in the library, not in the kitchen, not in the car. He undid the doctor's bandage with a jeweler's patience, and when he saw the cut again, he stopped. His hand trembled. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't dim light. It was a visible, long tremor that lasted 3 seconds, and that he covered by gently squeezing my wrist, as if the gesture could hide the tremor from me. It didn't hide it. I saw. He didn't look at me. He soaked the cotton. He cleaned around the stitches with such light touches that they barely hurt. He changed the new bandage with hands that became firm again in the middle of the work, but trembled again when he tied the last knot. When he finished, He didn't let go of my arm. He stayed there, head bowed, breathing higher than it should have been. "Say it," I whispered. He didn't lift his eyes. "Say it, Dante." He didn't answer. I know. Say it." That was when he raised his head. His face was without color, a paleness I had never seen in a living person, the kind only seen on those who have just received news of death. His eyes met mine, and for a fraction of a second I believed, with all the foolish faith of my life, that I had won him over. "I never loved you," he said. The voice came out firm. "I never will." He let go of my arm with care, like someone setting down a broken piece in the right display case. He stood up. He picked up the basin. He crossed the room. He closed the door behind him with the same exaggerated calm of someone who had rehearsed that exit in silence for weeks. I didn't cry in front of him. I waited until I heard his footsteps go down the staircase. I waited until I heard Ettore ask something downstairs, and Dante's voice answer with 2 syllables I couldn't make out. I waited until I heard a door close on the floor below. Then I got up. I took off the robe. I put on some dark dress, closed shoes, the lightest coat I could find. I grabbed the small bag and stuffed inside. The wallet, the passport, the old notebook where I listed art cities, the phone, and the new bandage Dante had tied on my arm, his knot still firm, as if I could carry with me the last careful gesture of his, and study it later as one studies a restored painting. I didn't call Tiziano. That night, I didn't even want family near. I went down the stairs. I grabbed the key to the small car in the courtyard, the one Dante had given me on the second day in Cefalù, saying it was mine, that Don Ferraro's wife needed to know how to drive on her own. I got in. I left through the lane without turning on the headlights until I reached the street, so no one in the house would notice. I drove aimlessly for 40 minutes. Palermo at dawn was a different city, empty, beautiful in a sad way, with old lampposts reflecting on the wet stones of the narrow streets. I passed Piazza Pretoria, I passed the cathedral, I passed all of Via Maqueda without realizing it, and when I came to my senses, I was already stopping the car in front of the usual old cafe, closed at that hour, with the kitchen lights still on by some miracle. The owner, an old man in a stained apron, opened the door without asking, as if he recognized in my face a known category of customer, and pointed me to the back table with a curt gesture. He asked nothing. He brought black coffee, water, and a small basket of stale bread. He moved out of my way. I sat down. It was there that he dropped the key. The next table was occupied by a man of about 40, dark suit, loose tie, a leather briefcase leaning against the chair. Handsome in a way I registered distractedly, without reacting. Dark hair with gray strands at the temples, long hands, the posture of someone who grew up being looked at. He was taking something out of his pocket when a small key slipped from his fingers and fell on the stone floor with a dry chink. He apologized in a low voice. He stood up, picked up the key, and as he sat down, he looked at me and saw, without disguise, my red eyes. He took an embroidered handkerchief from his inner pocket and held it out to me across the table. "It's none of my business," he said, "but nobody cries in a cafe at 4 a.m. over a small matter." I looked at the handkerchief. I looked at him. He had a calm tone of voice, low, with no urgency at all, the kind that seems to have learned to speak with anxious people somewhere long before that table. I accepted the handkerchief. "Thank you. Prego." We talked for nearly an hour. We talked about Caravaggio. We talked about the difference between restoring an 18th century canvas and a 16th century one. We talked about Florence, and he laughed quietly when he discovered that I had dreamed of a studio with windows facing the Arno since I was 16, and said, without pose, that he knew an old restorer near the Santa Trinita Bridge who still used hand-ground mineral pigments. I didn't ask his name. He didn't ask mine. It was only when the sky began to brighten in the narrow street, and I made a move to grab my bag, that he said, with that same calm, "Massimo Belandi." I stopped. I laughed without humor. It was obvious, now that the name was between us, that it had to be him. Who else would walk into an old cafe on Via Maqueda at 4 a.m. with a suit like that and patience like that? Massimo Belandi, historic enemy of the Ferraros, commander of the family with which Dante had been at active war for 2 decades. The man I should, in any other context, have recognized in 3 seconds. "Of course it's you," I said, low. Of course. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He didn't try to explain anything. He just took a small card from his inner pocket, wrote a number by hand on the back of it with an expensive pen, and pushed it across the table. "If one day you need a place where Dante Ferraro doesn't rule," he said, "that number answers at any hour." I stood up. I looked at the card for 3 seconds. I looked at him. I looked at the cafe door, where the light of the street was beginning to come in brighter, golden, indecent for a night like that. I took the card. I tucked it into my bag. "Buongiorno, signor Belandi," I said. "Buongiorno, signora." I left the cafe with the card burning inside my bag, with the embroidered handkerchief folded inside the coat pocket, and with the strange certainty that I hadn't thrown anything away, neither the handkerchief, nor the card, nor that piece of my night. I got into the car. I rested my forehead on the steering wheel for 2 minutes. I started the engine, and as I left Via Maqueda in the first morning sun, not knowing where to go, not knowing if I would return to the villa, not knowing if one day the name Ferraro would fit again in my mouth without hurting, I noticed a small thing that didn't leave me in peace for the rest of the way. I left with the card burning inside my bag and drove back without deciding where to. Chapter 5. The Enemy's Villa. My father's house smelled of medicine and old mass. I arrived shortly after midnight. With the cut on my forearm burning beneath the gauze, I had wrapped myself in the bathroom of the Ferraro villa before fleeing. The old nanny opened the door without asking anything. She just looked at my face, looked at the small bag on my shoulder, looked at the car parked crookedly in the lane, and opened the door wider. I went up the stairs without taking off my shoes. The old Don Colonna was awake in the bedroom, hunched up like a sick bird under the blanket. The heart medicine glittered on the nightstand in 3 different bottles. When he saw me, he tried to sit up against the pillow and failed. I sat on the edge of the bed. "Daughter," he said low, "you came back. For today." I couldn't lie even to him. Just for today. He closed his eyes. I recognized the gesture. It was the gesture he made when he was ashamed of not knowing how to fix something. He took my unhurt hand and held it with the weak strength of someone who still thought he was a father. "Go back to Dante, Serafina." His voice came out hoarse through the gaps in his breathing. "A man like him doesn't say things twice. He told me he never loved me, Papa." I spoke without crying. I'd already cried it all in the car, alone, with the headlights against the road. I don't need to hear a third. The old man prayed for me silently that night. I heard the rosary beads click on the rosary beside the bed, until sleep caught me sitting in the armchair, my head leaning against the wall. I woke up in the morning knowing 2 things with the same cold clarity. The first, if I stayed there, Dante would appear at the door before lunch. Ettore would already know. The capos in the Vucceria would already know. It was a matter of hours until a dark car pulled up in my father's lane, and Dante dragged me back by the hand without needing to raise his voice, because that's how he did things. In silence, with the certainty of someone who has already calculated the result. The second thing I knew was worse. I didn't want to be dragged back. Not like that. Not while his sentence was still wrapped around my chest like a sheathed knife that hurt with every breath. I took the card from my bag. It was wrinkled from my having opened and closed my hand over it all night. Just a number, written by hand, with the ink slightly faded at the ends, as if he had thought a fraction of a second before handing it to me. I looked at my father's phone on the dresser. I looked at the half-open door of the room where the old man slept. Finally, with his breathing steadier, I called. Massimo answered on the second ring, as if he had been sitting next to the device for hours. "Buongiorno, signora." "Don't call me that," I said. "Signorina Colonna, then, as you prefer." I gave a low laugh, without humor. It was funny in a way that hurt. The man who offered both names, as if I could choose which side of my life I wanted to descend to. "You said you had a place." "I do." 20 minutes, I said. 15. I hung up before he could add anything else. I put the card back in the bag, next to the embroidered handkerchief folded in 4 that I also hadn't been able to throw away. I kissed my father's forehead without waking him. I told the old nanny in the kitchen to tell Dante if he showed up that I was fine. She raised an eyebrow the way she raised it when she found something idiotic, but no longer had the age to argue. "Ben," she wiped her hand on her apron. "So you're letting your father die of shame too?" "I'm trying not to die first myself," I answered. The old nanny squeezed my shoulder once and went back to stirring the pot. That was all the affection she was going to give me that morning. I accepted it and left. Massimo's car pulled up in front of the gate exactly 14 minutes later. It wasn't a flashy car. It was a black sedan, discreet, the kind that passed on any street in Palermo without anyone looking up. The driver got out, took off his cap, opened the door for me without saying a word. It wasn't Tiziano, of course. Tiziano was family, and that day I had decided to vanish even from him. I sat in the back. I rested the bag in my lap. I looked through the window as the car went down the lane. The Palermo sun came in too strong. I smelled the sea coming from the port. mixed with the perfume of olive trees in the closed gardens of the neighboring houses, and for a moment, I imagined what it would be like to go back 10 years in time, with paint under my nails, without a husband's name, without a cut on my arm, without an enemy on the other side of the island waiting for me with a jeweler's patience. The Belandi villa was on the outskirts, more to the west, in a stretch of coast I had never had reason to know. We crossed a wrought iron gate with the family crest, an open pomegranate, I recognized it, and went up a lane of tall cypresses that ended in a courtyard of pale stones. Massimo was waiting for me at the top of the staircase. He was in a white shirt, no jacket, with his sleeves rolled up to the elbow, handsome in a calm way, which was a dangerous way to be handsome. He didn't come down the steps. He waited for me to climb up to him. "I didn't bring much," I said, lifting the bag. "You won't need it." He didn't touch me. It was the first thing I noticed and the last I would forget that entire week. Massimo Belandi, inside his own house, with the enemy's wife on his staircase, didn't extend even the tip of a finger to guide my elbow. He made a brief gesture with his head, and I understood it meant to come in. The room he gave me was on the second floor, with windows facing the sea, curtains of cream silk, white sheets pressed with the care of an old hotel, a new easel, set up in a corner near the window, with a blank canvas waiting, 3 brushes on top of a folded cloth, sealed tubes of oil paint on the small table, the sweet smell of turpentine still trapped in the lids. "It just turned up," Massimo said from the door, seeing my gaze. "I thought maybe it would be useful." "It just turned up," I repeated, without turning. He smiled. It was a careful smile, the kind that measured the ground before stepping. He left, closing the door with a delicacy that was almost a compliment. That first night, we dined alone at a table too long for 2 people. He didn't ask me questions about Dante. He didn't ask me questions about the cut on my arm, even though he had seen the gauze beneath my dress sleeve. He spoke of Florence with the naturalness of someone who had frequented the city at the right time of life. It was on the second night that Palermo began to know. Massimo took me to a restaurant in the Vucciria, without warning, without asking. He sat me at a central table. He ordered wine I hadn't asked for. He greeted 3 families in black capes who came in through the front door and looked at me out of the corner of their eye with the discretion that was the highest form of scandal in Sicily. I knew what was happening. I was being displayed, not touched, not courted, displayed, like a Caravaggio canvas that had moved walls. I returned to the villa that night, with the sour feeling of someone who had been used, and yet breathed better than she had been breathing in the Ferraro villa for weeks. It was on the 4th day that I began to see the cracks. The first was small. I tried to go down to the library after midnight, because I wasn't sleeping, and the doorknob of my room wouldn't yield. It wasn't locked by a key. It was locked by a latch from the outside, the kind that locks with a foot pushing a lever. I looked at the doorknob for 30 seconds. I knocked hard. The hallway guard opened on the 3rd knock, with the look of someone caught sleeping. "Mi scusi, signora," he said, blushing. "The latch falls on its own. Old house, my foot," I thought, but I smiled. I asked for a glass of water and went back to bed. The second crack was on an afternoon on the terrace. I was at the new easel, trying, without succeeding, to draw the lemon tree in the garden, when Massimo came into the room behind me, speaking quickly in Italian on the phone. He didn't see me. He said a sentence I caught half of, in the fraction of a second before he realized that the door to the terrace was open. Let Ferraro burn a little longer. Not much left, but the signal. He went silent on the word signal. He looked at me. I pretended not to have heard. He pretended not to have spoken. He went out into the hallway with the phone glued to his ear. I stood there with the dry brush in my hand for long minutes, looking at the lemon tree without seeing it, feeling my blood go cold at the back of my neck, in that specific way that was my body's warning. Attention. The 3rd crack was the count. It started with 2 of Massimo's housemen in the garden on the 1st morning. On the 3rd day, there were 3. On the 5th day, I counted 4 guards on the back fence, and a 5th leaning on the stone pillar near the front gate, with something under his coat that wasn't cold. Protection, Massimo would tell me, with that jeweler's smile, when I would ask, "Cara, these are dangerous times. Dante doesn't take it well that you're here." I would smile back. I would thank him. I would go up to the room. I would sit at the easel and pretend to paint, and while I pretended to paint, I thought of Dante. I thought of the man who had cleaned my cut with trembling hands and said the cruelest sentence I had ever heard. I thought of his gesture pressing his hand on my back at the Riva Salon. I thought of the painting I tore, and he restored in silence. I thought of the kiss in the library during the storm. I thought of how many lies fit in the same mouth of a man who didn't know how to lie at all well, and I thought for the first time with sober clarity that his silence was out of fear, not of contempt. Fear of what I still didn't know, but it was fear. On the 6th night, after dinner, I went up to the room and discovered that my bag had been touched. Not much. Almost nothing. A zipper out of place. The embroidered handkerchief folded in 3 instead of 4. Massimo's card at the wrong end of the inner pocket. It was enough. I sat on the edge of the bed and breathed slowly, with the blank canvas of the easel staring at me like a mute witness. That night I understood I needed to leave. I didn't yet know how. I didn't know where to. I only knew that Massimo Belandi's jeweler Patience had a reason, and that this reason wasn't exactly what he showed me at the table. I turned off the light in the room at 11. I lay down dressed, with the bag closed beside the bed, and stayed with my eyes open in the dark. That's when I heard the gravel in the garden. 1 step. 2. They weren't a guard's heavy steps. They were the steps of a man who knew how to walk without being heard, and yet he wanted, that night, that someone hear him. I got up, crossed the room barefoot, opened a slit in the curtain. The moon was clear enough to light half of the olive grove in the back, and between 2 crooked trees, standing in a dark jacket, without escort, without a visible weapon, with empty hands hanging at his sides like a man who had handed over all his weapons at the gate by his own will, was Dante Ferraro, looking at my window. I knew, by the way he stood there, that he had come in alone. I knew that the guards on the back fence, all 4, were either dead or counting his money in some pocket. I knew, above all, that he had come understanding that he might not return. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass. My heart beat once in a way I hadn't felt in a week, not from fear, not from rage, not from hurt. It beat the way the heart of a woman beats when she sees, on the other side of the window, the only person in the world she still wants to hear lie one more time, just to be sure that this time, the lie is different. I grabbed the shawl on the chair. I went down the stairs without making a sound, and I went out the back door of the enemy's villa to meet my husband among the olive trees. Chapter 6. Good morning, Signora Ferraro. The grass was wet with dew. I felt it through my bare feet before I felt anything else, before the air smelling of green olives, before the moon hitting the silver leaves of the olive trees, before the sound of my own shawl dragging behind me in the soft earth of the garden. I crossed the lawn toward the man standing between the 2 crooked trees. I didn't run. He didn't come up to me either. We met in the middle, beneath the largest of the olive trees, in a circle of weak light where the branches opened up the sky. Dante was thinner. I noticed this first, before the dark jacket, before the wrinkled shirt at the collar, before the sunken eyes. In 7 days the man had lost the weight of months, the beard grown out in a way he didn't let it grow, the hair fallen over the forehead. "How did you get in?" I asked. "On foot." His voice came out hoarse, dry from someone who hadn't spoken all day. "Through the woods. And the guards? They're sleeping." I looked at him with my eyebrow raised. He understood the look. "Alive," he completed, low. "I didn't come for that. I paid one of the young men at the fence as soon as I learned you were here. The consigliere keeps eyes in all enemy houses. Always. That's how you survive on this island. Today I called in the favor." He switched the others' shifts, released the dogs in the western kennel, and turned off the backlight circuit. "I have until dawn." I crossed my arms over the shawl. The chill of the dew rose up the hem of my dress. "What did you come for, Dante?" He took a deep breath once. It was the only time in my life I saw Dante Ferraro breathe like an ordinary man before speaking. "I came to tell you something I should have told you in the first week of Cefalù. Tell me now." He looked at the olive tree, at the ground, at me, and when he started to speak, his Italian came out lower than I had ever heard, almost a whisper, as if the story weighed too much to be said in a full voice. I was 19. He stopped. He swallowed. He started again. She was 22. I was going to marry her the following spring. My father had already drunk with her father 3 times. Everything decided. He didn't say her name. He didn't say it that night. And I, who had known his silences long enough, knew it was something he had been keeping between his teeth for 13 years. "They took her from my godfather's house in a borrowed car," he continued. "I arrived 2 minutes too late. They held me at a gate. They forced me to look." His fingers tightened the fabric of the jacket at the height of his thigh, and let go. "I was 19, Serafina. I learned that night that everything I touched was going to die. I felt the air entering my chest in a wrong way. That's why the separate room in Cefalù," I said low. "That's why the separate room in Cefalù. That's why the night of the storm." That's why I said it didn't change anything. That's why the attack. There was a pause between us in which the only thing that existed in the world was the sound of the olive leaves moving in the wind. I looked at him. He looked at me. You told me you had never loved me, I said. I lied. Say it again. He didn't hesitate. I lied. Firmer. I lied in the room, in the car, in the library. I lied with my mouth on your mouth. His voice trembled a single time and went back into place. I've loved you since the attic. I won't lie anymore. He took a step. Just one. He stopped. I won't lie anymore, he said. And if you don't come back with me, I'll go back alone. But I won't lie anymore. And he knelt. Dante Ferraro, Don of the Ferraro family, with 24 capos spread across Palermo, and half the island's port swearing on his name, knelt on the wet earth of the enemy's garden, both hands open on his thighs, his head slightly bowed. He offered me the thing no man of the Sicilian Cosa Nostra offered anyone, the exposed nape, the unguarded throat, and stayed there without saying another word, waiting for me to decide. I walked slowly to him. I touched my fingers to his hair. It was the first time I had touched him without him touching me first. The hair was damp from the dew. I felt his shoulder tremble once under my hand, and tremble no more. Get up, I said. I can stay here a little longer. No, Dante. Get up. He got up. We stood in the circle of light from the olive tree, too close, without kissing. He took off his dark jacket and put it over my shoulders on top of the shawl. My feet were cold. His hand brushed lightly against my cut arm, at the level of the gauze I still wore, and went down to my wrist, and didn't let go. Let's go through the back, he said. There's a service gate. Will you let me get the bag? He thought for half a second. He looked at the window of my room. He looked at the invisible guards asleep on the fence. He looked at me. No, he answered. In an hour at most, this house wakes up. I don't want you inside when that happens. I have things there. I'll buy you everything again. I looked at the second-floor window one last time. I thought of the easel that turned up by chance, of the new brushes, of the embroidered handkerchief folded in 3 instead of 4, of the crinkled card in the bag pocket I had opened and closed all night. I thought of Massimo Belandi sleeping in the master bedroom with his patient jeweler face undone for a few hours on the pillow. I thought of my sick father at the house in the Vucciria, and asked Dante, in a whisper, to send word so the old nanny would receive my message before breakfast. And I left with Dante. We left through the back gate without saying goodbye to anyone. Dante's car was hidden almost a kilometer away, behind a stone wall covered with ivy, on a road bypass I never would have guessed. He drove back to Palermo along the coast. The window on my side was open a finger's width, and the smell of the sea came in with the chill of dawn. I rested my temple against the glass. He drove with his right hand on the wheel and his left on mine, placed on my knee, without weight, without pressure, just set there, like someone leaving a document on top of the table so as not to lose sight of it. We didn't talk in the car. There was nothing more to say at that hour. When we arrived at the Ferraro villa, it was almost 4 a.m. Dante had all the gates closed. He dismissed the night staff with a single word to Ettore, who appeared in the hall dressed in a hurry, with his coat closed over his rumpled shirt, looked at me once, lowered his head in greeting, and disappeared down the hallway without asking anything. We went up the stairs together. He stopped on the landing of the second floor. Your room is as you left it, he said low. No one went in. I looked at the hallway to the right, where my room was, with the canopy bed, and the makeshift studio in the corner. I looked at the hallway to the left, where his room was, which I had never set foot in during all the months of marriage. I looked at Dante. Where do you sleep? I asked. He didn't answer right away. He looked at me with the patience of a man who knew that this question was worth more than it seemed. Wherever you let me, he answered. I took his hand and turned left. His room smelled of old books and the cologne I had been smelling on his shirt for months without ever being able to name. It was bigger than I expected, with a single window, tall, facing Palermo's invisible sea in the darkness, the 4-poster bed, a pair of dark rugs, a nightstand with a closed book, reading glasses folded on top, and a glass of water half-finished he hadn't finished that night. I sat on the edge of the bed. Dante didn't turn on the light. He sat on the floor in front of me, with his back against the foot of the bed, and rested his forehead against my knee. He stayed there. He didn't touch me anywhere else. Just his forehead, on my knee, and his breathing slowing down little by little against the fabric of my dress. I put my hand in his hair. I ran my fingers once from the top of his head to the nape. I felt, beneath my palm, his shoulder release a weight that, I understood at that moment, was 13 years old. "Stay," I whispered. He came up. He sat on the bed beside me. He pressed his forehead against mine. His hands found mine in the dark. His breath warmed my mouth, and when he kissed me differently from the library of the storm, not like someone drowning, like someone arriving. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, low, his mouth still on mine. "I know." "Say it again. You're not going anywhere." He turned off the nightstand lamp. Chill, roar. I woke up later with the sun. That was the first thing that came in. The Palermo sun, golden, low, crossing the tall window diagonally and hitting the foot of the bed. The sheets were rumpled. The air had that warm smell of morning too far past the right hour to wake up, and no one in the villa seemed in any hurry to come for us. His hand was open over my belly, on top of the nightgown I didn't remember putting on. I lay still. I felt his breathing behind the back of my neck, slow, deep, still sleeping. I felt the weight of his arm stretched across my body as if it were the most natural thing in the world for him to be there. I looked at the nightstand on my side. My plain band of old gold, the one I hadn't taken off once since the wedding at the chapel in the woods, was on the table. It took me a few seconds to understand. Then I remembered, at night, before turning off the light, I myself had taken it off, not to give back, not to flee, to touch his skin with my bare finger, without the cold gold between us for the first time. I had laid the ring on the nightstand with the tip of my finger. I had forgotten to put it back on. I looked at the ring there, glinting low in the morning light. I felt his hand move slightly over my belly. The thumb made a single short movement, like someone checking that I was still there. The breathing behind the back of my neck changed rhythm. "Good morning, Signora Ferraro," he said, low in my ear. I smiled without opening my eyes. "Good morning." He pulled me a millimeter closer. He fitted his forehead into the back of my neck. His hand over my belly didn't leave its place. I took his hand with mine on top and intertwined my fingers. We stayed like that for some time. I heard a bird sing on the roof. I heard the villa's morning beginning slowly on the other side of the door. A glass in the kitchen, a cabinet door, the low voice of Ettore downstairs giving some order with the care of someone who didn't want to wake the house. I was at peace. It was the first time in my life that I thought that word without irony and didn't feel any urge to correct the thought. I was at peace. His hand on my belly, the ring on the nightstand, the sun in diagonal. The man who had lied for 13 years breathing behind the back of my neck like someone learning to breathe for the first time. For half a second, on the way back to sleep, a stray thought crossed my head. The bag that had been left at the Belandi villa, with the embroidered handkerchief and Massimo's card inside the inner pocket. I thought I needed to ask someone to fetch it. Ettore would send a man. It was simple. It was domestic. It was a bag. I squeezed Dante's hand harder over my belly. I forgot the bag. I went back to sleep. Lena here. That wraps up book 1, and I've already finished book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. I thought we finally had peace. Serafina had come back to my bed with her scent on my pillow, the ring close to my hand, and that silent courage of someone who touched a monster as if he were still a man. I told her I loved her. For the first time, I left my whole heart in her hand. Then she got into Tiziano's car and disappeared. The note said Belandi. The audio had her voice, and the absence had the exact taste of betrayal. For 3 days, Cicely whispered that my wife had used me, broken me, and gone back to Massimo. I almost believed it, until I saw the camera. Serafina was smiling at the camera, but that gesture at her wrist wasn't goodbye. It was a warning. And, when I understood what she was saying, my wife had already been in his hands for 3 days. Like I said, that was just a taste of book 2. To watch it uncensored, just click on the first link here in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in a few seconds. Remember, just click on the first link down here in the comments, and book 2 complete, no ads, no interruptions, will already be available for you. It's very simple. Book 2 is something I'm loving making. You're loving it too, so I promise there will be more. It's where you find increasingly spicy stories, a true dark romance. And precisely because this version is getting more and more heated, the video isn't well accepted publicly on YouTube. This closed environment is where I can actually share my essence and where I feel free to do my best work for you. More news coming soon. I'll be waiting for you on the other side. Congratulations! Your purchase has been confirmed, and you now have full access to books 1 and 2 of all our stories, completely ad-free and uninterrupted. Everything is available on the My Stories platform, from Mafia romance and billionaire romance to our spicier tales. This content is ready for you now, with new episodes added daily. Access is simple. Just log in using the same email address you used for your purchase. A confirmation has also been sent to that same email. The My Stories platform is very simple and intuitive. Each image represents a story. If it has a book too, just click and press play. Everything is already unlocked for you. You can also rate each story, leave a like, and write a comment. Your feedback will be visible to all our other subscribers. This is our romance universe, so please feel free to interact. From this moment on, this is officially your home for romance stories. Just head over to mystoriesromance.com and press play. Welcome to the family.